Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT and SAT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we have Sam Hassell from Westchester Prep and Great Minds Advising back on the show with us. And Sam, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself for the people who haven't heard you before.
Sure. So I am one of the owners at Westchester Prep, which is a boutique tutoring, test prep, and college advising company. We're situated in Westchester, New York, right above New York City. And I particularly run our college advising branch, which is called Great Minds Advising.
Great. And so basically today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest changes or sort of pieces of news in the college admissions world probably in 2024. I know it's early, but I imagine this is going to be one of the biggest ones the whole year. And that is the decision by first Dartmouth and then Yale and then Brown in succession to reinstate testing requirements for the SAT and ACT scores for their colleges. So really a big change in the college admissions landscape after test optional has been pretty dominant since COVID hit. What do you think brought about this change?
So I think there's sort of a two-pronged answer here that we've seen from most of the committee reports. So a lot of these colleges actually, they had committees convene, different researchers, social scientists, faculty members to sort of study the data, often commissioned by the presidents of the universities, and they provided, a briefing to those presidents. And so there are two main factors in their findings that cause them to reconsider the test optional policies. So the first one is looking at students who had submitted test scores in these periods or not submitted test scores. They did find that the test scores have been quite predictive of freshman year GPA. So freshman year GPA is the most common metric that's used to basically assess how a student, is faring at the college, right? Can they handle the college's academic environment and keep up with the rigor? And so they did find that students who, submitted test scores, that these scores are more predictive of, success in the freshman year class and at the college. And the second reason that they've gotten, they've shifted some of these policies has been they actually found, so there's been a lot of debate around whether the testing requirements provide a certain obstacle to diversity, and the fact that students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds might not have the same advantages as students who come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. They don't have the same resources. There's maybe some hardships imposed by having to get to the testing centers or pay the fees, etc. What we've seen is that they found when they went test optional, they thought that was going to provide a much more flexible way of diversity students getting into these applicant pools and getting into these colleges, because now those students could go around this sort of traditional barrier of the standardized testing requirement. However, what they actually found was that there are many diversity students who actually did take the SAT or the ACT and had a score that maybe wouldn't be the most impressive for a student who comes from a higher socioeconomic background or maybe goes to a very good public or private school, and maybe a score that wouldn't even really be in the college's range, their score range altogether. So we might have a student, for example, let's say who comes from a pretty disadvantaged backgrounds and doesn't go to the best public school. They don't send a lot of kids to Brown, for example, right? There are some schools in the United States where they might have, 6 kids from their senior class going to Brown. That might be a feeder school. And then you might have a high school that's never sent a kid to Brown ever, right, in its entire history. So that student who comes from that school that might be underfunded, under-resourced, more disadvantaged, they might have something like a 1420 on the SAT. And that, in like just across the country, that's a very high percentile SAT score, right? We're talking about maybe like a
Yeah.
97th. I'm not sure off the top of my head what percentile it is, but it's a very high percentile, right? However, they're applying to Brown, one of the best schools in the United States. And, Brown's range is going to be significantly higher than that for the SAT. So that student might look at
Mhm.
Brown's score range and they might say, well, I might be 60, 70 points below the beginning of Brown's range. And, this is test optional. I'm not going to submit that score. What the student didn't understand is those scores are evaluated in the context of the student's background. Where did they go to high school? What socioeconomic status? What racial or ethnic background, etc. The student who goes to Stuyvesant in New York City, one of the best public schools in the country, and has a
Mhm.
1420, is going to be evaluated much more harshly than the student who is maybe an underrepresented minority at an under-resourced school in the South Bronx.
Mhm.
So they didn't want students actually misinterpreting that sort of the sort of punch of their score. Their score might actually, not in an absolute sense, or looking at the school's general range, it might not seem impressive. But actually, that 1420 does actually tell me that student is at least capable enough to do reasonably well at Brown, right? Whereas if they submit nothing, I have no idea if this kid's actually like an 1120 on the SAT, right? And this is
Mhm.
like the first
Right.
kid that I'm taking to Brown, or like this high school almost sends no kids to Brown. So I don't have a lot of data to go off of, right? And there's this notion, some people have spoken about this, is this notion of like an imputed score, which is if a student didn't actually submit a score, what would the
Mhm.
college think their score might actually be? Like if you had to guess a score based on their grades, their high school, their background, well, you could argue like they just can't guess at all. So it's like they might assume the worst case. Like I might just assume this kid has a 1080, right? I might assume this kid has a 12.
Right.
But knowing they actually have a 1420 actually rules out a whole bunch of the variance that would be, I would be really worried if they could come to Brown and actually academically excel. 1420
Mhm.
isn't the best score for Brown, but it wouldn't make me think like this kid's definitely in over their head at Brown, right?
Yeah.
So that is sort of one of
And
the
it's
ways.
also,
Yeah.
oh yeah, sorry, I was gonna say also, I mean, because GPA and grades have become so inflated, right? I think it's like 47% of all high school students in the US have a 4.0. Like having that cross school comparison tool is really helpful for making those kind of perspective based decisions, right? Without if there were no test scores, then you could be the valedictorian of a school in the South Bronx, but they still wouldn't really know like how you stacked up versus the Stuyvesant kid. I can't pronounce that school's name.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Sty, right? Isn't it Sty something?
Yeah, Stuyvesant. So yes, that's definitely true. The test scores provide a common metric on which to evaluate students. Otherwise, you are comparing apples to oranges in terms of high schools. And the valedictorian at one school, if you put them at another school, like they might very well be like the 100th ranked kid, if you were taking them to a very like top notch private school. So it's very apples and oranges, and it really does help to give the school confidence that the students can still thrive in this academic environment versus just having the total uncertainty of, I don't know if this kid might be an 1100, 1200, SAT score. You at least know this is a very competent kid academically. Might not be the best score, but it at least gives you like a pretty good, you feel at least pretty good in accepting them to Brown, that they're not going to be over their head.
Got it. Yeah. And I just think in general, right? Like, I mean, I think that most of these universities have been like what sort of sold them on test optional in the first place, like you mentioned, was that it would hopefully give more opportunity to people from these like backgrounds with less privilege. The problem, it turned out, was that people from privileged backgrounds have lots more advantages than just test scores, right? They are able to afford summer camps, extracurriculars, tutors for classes. They go to private schools, right, that are higher achieving. They oftentimes will be able to get like summer internships and, they can afford sports equipment. Like, there's just so many, or music equipment. There's just so many other things that, like, will give an applicant an advantage if they come from a privileged background besides test scores, that in a weird way, test scores actually ended up being one of the fairest ways to evaluate candidates, even though yes, you can pay for more tutoring for the ACT or SAT, or you can buy prep programs that maybe you wouldn't otherwise be able to afford, or things like that. Even with all of that, it's still better to have a somewhat fair, quote unquote, arena than to, not have it at all.
Yes. And I think there's just certain inextricable inequities. Nothing in life is ever going to be 100% fair, right? It's like nobody almost definitionally is going to have the same exact experience or access. Like, it's just very different. I mean, even two kids in the same family might have different experiences. So it is almost, it does sort of in some cases, even though it's well intentioned, there is some nitpickiness where it feels like people are looking for something that's like absolutely perfect in terms of a
Mhm.
measure. And that probably doesn't exist, nor will it probably ever exist in terms of a perfect, common, universal measure.
Mhm.
But I think the really important point that you started alluding to is, and Brown recently, as Brown just announced actually yesterday, that they are bringing back standardized testing and making it mandatory. They use this term testing in context. And this basically alludes to the notion, as we just said, that they are looking at the context of the applicant and evaluating their scores and their performance, inside of that context. Now, this sort of has two sides to it. If you are a student, as we just kind of mentioned, who is coming from a more disadvantaged or doesn't go to the best high school, has a reputation of sending kids to top schools, you're going to get curved up, basically, right?
Mhm.
Which means that's sort of the thing that a lot of people with the test optional and the anti-SAT, ACT argument didn't quite account for, was that the colleges have always tended to curve these kids' scores in a way, right? They
Mhm.
understand they're coming from these backgrounds. It's basically just assumed. These are just baked in assumptions, right? That like this kid didn't have the private tutor. They don't have a college advisor. They've always sort of curved those students accordingly. The other side of that is if you're a student and you do come from, more of a higher socioeconomic background or live in one of those areas, or you go to a much better high school. Um, Unfortunately, I won't go so far as to say like you are explicitly being curved down, but you are being definitely compared to a much higher bar, right? You're being held to a much higher standard. And I think if we talk about the sort of the equity standpoint, nobody's going to feel bad for a kid who's lives in a very privileged area and goes to an amazing high school. Nobody's going to feel bad for that kid. But I'll give you just a quick
Mhm.
example of a kid. I spoke to his dad several years ago. I went to a very good public school. His GPA, and this is in a very affluent area. So like on paper, he's not going to be given a lot of benefits of the doubt. I'll put it that way, right? He had maybe
Mhm.
like a 1560 SAT score, right? Now, and his GPA was maybe like a 3.2. So you're like, well, what are the colleges thinking about this kid? Like he goes to a very top-notch public school, very affluent area. And he has a very low GPA, and then he has this crazy high SAT score. What they're gonna think is he was probably tutored to death. He probably took the test 7 times, right? Has like
Mhm.
a small army of tutors. And because he's privileged, like that's why he got that, because his GPA is pretty bad, right? So like you wouldn't expect a kid who has like a 3.2 to have like a 1560 SAT, right? Those are
Mhm.
just the assumptions. Now, I actually know the kid did basically no prep, right? He basically got that score
Mhm.
almost raw, right? He just happens to be the kind of kid who doesn't work very hard in school, which is another issue, right? And also not very
Right.
likable Admissions officers do not like kids who have really high testing scores and very low GPAs, because the way that I read that is you have a lot of potential, but you don't use it, right? You don't work hard in school, right?
Right.
So it's not actually like a big benefit. A lot of people do this like averaging, where they're like, I have a really low GPA and a really high test score, so like they're going to average out. It's like, no, no, no. The discrepancy actually makes the perception of you possibly worse, right? Because it's like this kid has
Mhm.
all this potential and they're so smart and they're not doing anything with it.
Mhm.
So that kid had a very big perception problem, because like the schools are just going to think like his GPA is more representative and he probably just like prepped forever for the exam and that's how he got an amazing score, when I know he actually didn't do any prep for the exam and got an amazing score. These assumptions are
Mhm.
baked in both cases. The kid who comes from a low SES background might just happen to know somebody who gave them pro bono tutoring for 6 months, right?
Mhm.
But they're going to assume that's not the case. They're going to assume that kid had no tutoring, right? And so they're going to curve up their score.
Right.
Then the kid who comes from the privileged background, they're going to look at the average score from the high school. They're going to assume the kid had a ton of tutoring. And honestly, they might not have done anything for the test and might have just hit that score raw, but it doesn't matter because those aren't the assumptions that are being made based on their background and context. It's a little bit unfair on both sides, right? These generalizations might generally hold true, but
Mhm.
having heard a lot of admissions officers talk about this topic, it just is what it is. And they assume that the kids who come from the lower, more diverse backgrounds have very little to no resources, and the kids who come from the very high backgrounds are very well resourced, regardless of whether that actually ends up being true, because there's so many different cases.
Mhm. Yeah. Now let's talk about also, I want to talk about like the specific schools too, right? Because this was, Dartmouth, Yale, and Brown, and it wasn't like every school like has suddenly done this yet, though I'm sure that there will probably be. My guess, as we're sitting here in early March of 2024, is that there's going to be a wave of schools that go back to requiring this, especially on the high end. But for now, it's just these three schools, right? What do you feel like their findings were, and kind of how much of that has to do with the fact that they're Ivy League schools versus like other types of schools?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of news headlines. The schools that tend to make their way into the New York Times, the Washington Post, tend to be the Ivies, and the most prestigious schools in the United States. There's not a lot of news headlines that are written about, other schools that are maybe like more regional schools, or not the very, quote unquote, what we tend to consider like the real prestige schools, the top Ivies. I think this also tracks just with like, the case against Harvard. Like everything's about Harvard, right? It's like, the
Hmm.
Harvard versus the Asian community, Harvard, the Supreme Court. It's like everything is almost about Harvard, right? Because like it's just one of the shiniest parts, of academia, and American culture. So I think these recent wave of these policy changes have been at a lot of the very top schools, the Browns, the Dartmouths, the Yales, and those are the schools that tend to catch the headlines. We do have to be a little bit careful about how well these findings actually generalize, or how well this change in policy will actually generalize to the rest of the landscape. So as I mentioned, these changes have basically been recommendations that have been provided by committees that the schools have commissioned to study the data and to look at the data and say, how does this policy affect diversity applicants? How do these students do at our school? But it's specific to the school, right? Brown is not making an overall assertion or looking at all of the freshman year GPAs across all of the 3,000 colleges in the United States. They're looking at how kids do specifically in their freshman year at Brown, out of the kids who applied to Brown, right? And
Hmm.
this is a finding from a committee at Brown by professors who work at Brown, right? So I think these headlines tend to almost like maybe make people think that this is representative of like the whole country or how all colleges think, and I think that's a little bit of a tenuous argument. These are very specific findings. When we talk about, you mentioned grade inflation before, right? Or not even necessarily
Hmm.
grade inflation, but just if you're talking about Ivy League schools, these students all pretty much have A averages, right? At
Mhm.
a school where all of the applicants, or the competitive applicants at least, are going to all have A averages, of course, some other factor above and beyond their GPA is going to be important for distinguishing them or providing additional predictive value as to how they're going to do.
Right. Well, and also, like, an important point is just because these kids had A averages in high school does not mean that they can meet the academic rigor of an Ivy League school.
Right. 100%. And if you have, if you have a school where maybe the academic rigor isn't considered maybe quite on that level, or the applicant, the grades might be much more heterogeneous, right? So you have some, like you have some kids getting in and they're mostly B students, with like, it's a lot more heterogeneous. It's not just all A students basically applying where you're like, these kids are all meshing together. I need to look at other variables like their testing, their resume, their activity, like all these other factors. That pressure doesn't exist for a lot of other schools that aren't as competitive, right? You need to look as many variables.
Mhm.
Like you can possibly just get in based off of just your GPA, just having a good, getting good grades, not even hard classes, not even, it's like if you're applying to a top 300 school, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's really important that we are talking about the best schools in the country and their findings are not necessarily generalizable to every other institution, which I would say basically the takeaway from there is we're just seeing these schools and these findings in the big newspaper headlines, and then there might be a tendency to assume like
Mhm.
all the dominoes are going to start falling, and like now 1,000 colleges are going to go back and get rid of test optional. I don't think that that's actually going to happen. And even among some of the Ivies, like Penn also announces extending test optional, Columbia's test optional indefinitely. Even among the Ivies in the top schools, they also still disagree, right? So I just want to like caution people that these are very institution specific determinations and evaluations of data, and depending on what they want to prioritize. If a school said that they didn't prize, they weren't trying to optimize for diversity, like they would have a very different optimization scheme, right? Like they wouldn't be looking at like, how is this conducive to diversity? So it really depends on the institutional priorities, right? If they wanted to pick a different measure instead of freshman year GPA as a metric, like this would change the findings quite a bit, right? And so people need to understand because they just see a headline. You need to look and see what's being measured. Why do they care about that? Maybe another school doesn't care about that as much. Maybe another school doesn't have as much of a diversity problem. So maybe they don't need to optimize as much. Maybe they're not as worried as much about the diversity because like they have a lot of diversity, right? So that's what I would
Mhm.
caution. The last thing that I'll say on this is there's a really interesting case. I call this the curious case of Caltech. So Caltech
Yeah.
is arguably the most difficult school in the United States to get into. It has a much smaller student population than MIT. MIT tends to be a little bit more well known and a bit of a bigger brand name than Caltech. However,
Mhm.
most people would argue that Caltech is every bit as good as MIT, and it accepts way fewer students than MIT. So its acceptance rate generally is around like the Harvard, Stanford level. Like we're talking about like a 3% acceptance rate, right? Now, Caltech is test blind. And so if we're thinking about, well, one of the reasons why they're returning these test requirements is because, the students can't thrive at such a rigorous institution unless I know they have a very high SAT or ACT score. Um, you might really wonder, Caltech is extremely rigorous. I would say Caltech is possibly an order of magnitude more rigorous than Brown, Yale, and Dartmouth, right? It is extremely difficult, especially, it's first and foremost, it's a technical institute and it's first and foremost in STEM. It's very rigorous. You might say, well,
Right.
how is this school? How could they do without testing? Like they're not even test optional. They're test blind. They don't even consider test scores at all. How do they not just have kids
Mm.
showing up and like flunking out of these super rigorous hard STEM classes, right? Without the standardized
Mhm.
testing check. And so this is where this institutional specificity comes in. If you think about Caltech, a lot of the students that are applying to Caltech, because there's so few that they actually take, are so accomplished in STEM in other ways that are clear from their profiles that looking at an
Mhm.
SAT math score actually doesn't matter a lot or doesn't provide a ton extra predictive validity. A lot of these kids are competition math kids, right? And if you're winning math
Yeah.
competitions at like a regional, national level, it's like assume that you're probably crushing the SAT math, right? Because like that's the harder out of the two, right? So it's, these kids have very substantial accolades in STEM fields. They might be taking very far above and beyond college coursework, beyond their high school's STEM offerings, right? And so
Mhm.
for Caltech specifically, those students might have such clear, honest signals that they're so accomplished already in STEM that it's almost like they don't actually need this signal, right? It's like giving a Nobel laureate in chemistry an SAT to see how good they are at SAT math. It's like it seems backwards, right? Like I already have the more important thing. I don't need to like worry about the thing that would predict the success when I already have the success, right? So I think it's very important. That's a very interesting case of an extremely competitive, rigorous school at which they are pulling off a no test score policy. But a lot of schools are not Caltech, and so they might need the test scores, and they do
Right.
serve very important institutional priorities.
Right. Yeah, and I mean the other thing too is for the schools that exist outside of like, Caltech, et cetera, um, there's also, I think that the test optional policies create a lot of confusion, right? Like I think one of the uh, things that we talked about even earlier, right, was like a kid with a 1400 who would have submitted that score to Brown, maybe didn't because he thought it was below the average, but then that actually would have been helpful for him, right? And I mean, unless you're working with a college admissions expert, which not everyone can afford to do, again, going back to that equity piece, like you're not really going to know whether it's a good idea to submit your test scores to a specific school or not. I feel like that also is a big factor in this.
Yes, so I sort of call this like the role of student agency in the submission of test scores, and it's a really interesting point that during test optional, and we saw this, right? We are a college advising company, work with a lot of students, and they have the benefit of our expertise and they have us as a resource basically to make these complex decisions that emerged in the test optional phase. Now it became how good is your score compared to the school's range? Is it high enough in the range? How does this compare to your GPA? How does this compare to your background, your socioeconomic status, your high school's average? We can look at historical trends, the common data set. We can look at, your section scores and do they map onto your academic narrative? Like we could look at a million different variables to make an extremely informed decision as to whether to submit or not. That those kids would just never be able to come anywhere close to of their own accord, right? And
Hmm.
that was a lot of complexity as our students are quite fortunate in that they actually have our expertise, but there are a lot of students who don't. And so they're making these
Hmm.
decisions without a lot of information or expertise. And that really it's really difficult to just underscore how complex the considerations became of should I submit or should I not submit, or I have these scores, which ones do I submit, or do I super score it in this way because I could super score these two sittings or these three. Like these are actually pretty complex decisions, and you need a lot
Right.
of information. I think test optional in a lot of ways, if we talk about inequity, and you saw this in the Brown reports, they said test optional made it way more confusing for students as to whether to submit or not, and they weren't necessarily making the right decisions. And so what actually ended up happening is the students who still came out more advantaged were the kids who, of course, had college advisors and, had experts who were helping them make these complex decisions. And so all that it sort of ended up doing was introducing different inequities in the name of promoting equity, right? And
Right.
and then those kids also, if you look at the Brown report, there was an executive summary that came out yesterday. They also said those are the students where maybe, somebody's telling them, a college advisor, like your score's not quite good enough. You're coming from Stuyvesant. Don't submit the 1420, right? It's not good enough for
Hmm.
Brown. But then, we're also helping them position themselves, cultivate their activities, their admissions narrative. And so they have all these other things that serve as a hedge against going test optional. Whereas the kid who comes from an underprivileged background doesn't have all those extra things in their resume. They don't know what they need to be doing. and they don't have all those hedges against not submitting a test score.
Got it. And I mean, I think in general, it's just so much that God, I mean, I think this was a worthy experiment, but there are so many, it really revealed how the college admissions process is kind of a symptom of inequality in this country rather than a cause, right? There are so many, like, even when they were trying to make things more equitable, it just created new inequities that, again, like wealth had a big impact on.
Yes.
It's just, you can't get away from it, I guess,
It's hard, right? It's
in
a very
capitalist America.
Yeah, it's a very worthy, noble battle. But I think what we see is like it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole in some cases. It's like you whack one mole, but another one just pops up anyway, and it's like you can't really see all of the implications until they rolled out the test optional policies. In a lot of cases, as pilots, right? They were going to evaluate the data from rolling out the test optional policies, and that's what we're seeing. We're now seeing the findings, of what happened by running this experiment. And
Mhm.
another point that I want to just kind of make on that role of student agency is we often hear students, guidance counselors, or people, they will just say like, a student will be like, should I submit this score? Is it good enough for this college's range? And the guidance counselors will be like, it's up to you, right? Those are like our
Right.
three least favorite words. It's up to you, right? Is like you are
Mhm.
entrusting a kid who's not an expert in this field. They don't know how admissions officers are evaluating their applications.
They're also a teenager.
Yes, they're a teenager, right? And it's like we don't want to deprive them of all of their agency or making any decisions, but sometimes it's like, test optional gave them possibly too much agency and created way too much complexity as to what the right
Mhm.
decisions were. And we now have evidence that there were certain students, particularly a lot of diversity students, who were making the wrong decisions and did not submit test scores that would have helped their cases. And
Mhm.
it might in some ways be a little bit fair to actually take that agency away and just say everybody needs to basically submit their test scores.
Right. Yeah, which is why I don't know. I found that like you said, I think maybe it was on the podcast we did previously, but the idea that we're kind of moving from test optional to more like test preferred or test recommended, which is why I found Yale's test flexible, as they called it, policy to just not really help the situation that you just described, right?
Yeah, so I think when we start getting into test flexible, test preferred, test recommended, test optional, test required, it's like I think we know it's like getting a little out of control. Right? It's like, and this sort of admissions officer saying like we prefer the tests. It's this notion of what they were trying to say was if you don't submit your test score, you're not, in and of itself, that does not put you at a disadvantage, but it might put you at a disadvantage compared to another applicant who's submitting the test score, right? And if you're coming from a more privileged, higher SES background or a better high school, there's kind of like a wink wink that like you're not going to get off as easily as the kid who maybe comes from a more diverse background. And so this was very difficult for them to navigate. It was like test optional with an asterisk. So then they kind of changed it like, it's like kind of test preferred or like the
Optional
dean score.
squared.
Yes. Now, the reason why I don't like Yale's test flexible policy is because it just leaves a lot of this ambiguity, right? I would say
Mhm.
that this policy is extremely confusing and it is basically like a half measure, right? It's not,
Yeah.
we're saying test optional or we're going test blind or we're going, you know, I mean, the far ends of the spectrum are just being test blind or test required, right? It's like very clear cuts, right? We require all scores or we
Mhm.
don't look at any scores. Very clear cut. Test optionals even a little bit in the middle, but then test flexible is like even more confusing possibly than test optional. And when we
Mhm.
just spoke about, is this a good thing? Like, what are they trying to optimize for here? Right? Why did Yale
Mhm.
go test flexible and these other schools just went back to being test required? Well, if you're a student and let's say you're not going to hit the best SAT or ACT score, or maybe you can't do SAT or ACT tutoring, again, we're mostly talking about students from diverse backgrounds, not privileged backgrounds, right? If you have an AP score or two where you got two fives, right? And you're going to submit that to the college, it's just like what we said with if a student had a 1420, it's not the best, but it's some evidence that they're going to come to your competitive school and do pretty well. If a student got 2 5s on APs or a 4 and a 5, and they're coming from an underprivileged background, it at least gives me some standardized testing and some objective validity that they can do well at this school. And it's at least something I compare apples to apples in some ways, right? It's like they take an AP at this school that has never sent a kid to Brown, but like so does the other kids at this other school that sends a lot of kids to Brown. And now I can actually compare them, right? A 5 is a 5 is a 5,
Right.
right? So what this is really intended to, and like I want to be very clear because the colleges are not being clear. This policy is not, if you are a kid and you go to a good public school or a good private school, you're not disadvantaged, you're not an underrepresented minority, you're not checking a lot of these diversity boxes. This policy is not really aimed at you. This policy is aimed to catch the kids in some other alternative ways that maybe just would have an AP score, an IB score, that would actually help them and would give the admissions officers some confidence that they could still come to this challenging academic environment and still succeed beyond just looking at their high school's GPA, which might be very much a question mark as to what that GPA means from this high school, right? But what I really worry about is a lot of students, because they do this all the time, is they're going to now try to like seize upon the flexibility of this policy, and they go to a really good public school and they're not really the people that they're talking to, and they're going to think, oh, I have 2 4s on AP exams and I'm going to submit that instead of a 1540 SAT score and I'm going to get into Yale. The answer is you're not going to get into Yale in all likelihood, right?
Right.
And
I mean, if you had a 1540, you would want to send that probably.
100%, but I'm saying they might think it's good enough in lieu of the 1540, right? Because this policy allows you to say, oh, I have a 4 and a 5. I could submit that instead of a 1540, right? Now, the answer here is if you come from a more privileged background, you go to good schools and you're applying to Yale, which is one of the hardest schools to get into in the world, right? You're talking about roughly 1 in 25 students out of the most like talented kids in the world are getting in. The answer isn't like an either or for you. The answer is like a both and, right? That's actually one of Yale's mottos is and, not or, right? And so you won't get away with submitting a couple of reasonably good AP scores instead of an SAT or an ACT. It's just unfortunately they don't want to tell you that because who they're really talking to is more of the diversity, and that's why the policy is more flexible. It's flexible for those students, and that's true of Brown and Dartmouth as well, who are requiring scores. They're saying the reason we went back to required is because we want to catch more of those kids who might have a 1420 on the SAT and not just miss on them because they come from more diverse backgrounds, right? So what they're really trying to do is make it more fair still for the diversity students. Yale is just doing it in a little bit of a different way. But I worry that it's going to be confusing to a lot of kids who aren't quite the targets of this policy, and they will think they can get away with submitting a couple of good AP scores because they maybe only have like a 1460 on the SAT, and unfortunately a 1460 on the SAT is not going to cut it at Yale if you're not a diversity candidate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like you said, where I think the best thing that admissions offices can do is try to reduce ambiguity because I think the ambiguity is where a lot of the problems have been coming from, especially for, trying to improve diversity in the applicant pool. The more that you can make the process less confusing, the better, right? And I just think that, yeah, I'm pretty much agree with you on kind of it's a bit of a half measure. I think it's probably designed that way, but the result is that it doesn't really make anyone happy.
Yes, and I would say as well that one form of inequity might be considered being very lacking in transparency, and admissions is often called a black box for a reason. They're just saying like their advice, Yale's advice, if you listen to them on podcasts, is just like you get to choose, right? It's a student agency model. Like you get to choose. It's like, yes, they get to choose, and they might choose something that actually was injurious to their candidacy because they made the wrong decision because they don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. And so I think it's like this it's what we tend to see in admissions a lot, which is this surface level positivity, like, oh, it's so flexible and like you get to choose. But actually, in reality, it can be more harmful because it's, again, giving agency to kids who are not experts, don't know the decisions. They don't see the harsh judgments that are being made behind the scenes and what they actually say about kids, right? Behind closed
Mhm.
doors, when you're just evaluating all the best kids in the world, you would be shocked at what they actually say about amazingly talented kids because like they just have so many of them, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so I think in a lot of ways it is a form of inequity, this constant confusion that sort of has the shiny veneer of like flexibility is not really what it's sort of made out to be. And it's just like they're very all over the place. They're like, it's up to you, but it's, as a student, it's, if you're doing the AP route, you're gonna have to submit all of your AP scores. The problem with that is like
Mhm.
they include your whole testing record, right? So it's like if you have one bad AP, you have to send the whole report. So it's like now this creates other issues where, okay, cool, you might have 2 5s, but now you better make sure you don't get a 3 because now that's going to be included too. Whereas if you're doing the
Mhm.
SAT ACT route, you could pick which scores you're going to choose to send the colleges, right? So there's all these additional strategic complexities. And their answer is mostly, hey, this is super flexible now and figure it out yourself. And like, I
Right.
know how this ends. A lot of kids are not going to figure it out themselves in the right, most strategically advantaging way.
Right. Exactly. Well, so with all that, I feel like we've kind of covered the main takeaways from the new Ivy League testing requirements. Do you have anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
So I would just say, sort of going back to one of the points that I made earlier, these are all institution specific decisions from institution specific committees. It will be very interesting to see what happens with the landscape, but I would not say, I think just seeing all these headlines in the New York Times makes people think that this is like, these are overarching huge claims about just standardized testing in general for all colleges. And I think it would just be nice if people could have a little bit of context and a little bit of nuance. I know it's very difficult in 2024. And the way that newspapers
Right.
sell, newspapers is they're
Headlines.
big headlines,
Yeah.
right? The shiniest schools. And if you are applying to these schools, certainly you have to do everything for your candidacy that you possibly can. And standardized testing has always been something like, even when they were test optional, it's like for our students who wanted to go to Yale, it wasn't test optional. It was basically still test required. Nothing had essentially changed, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I would just say like we don't actually know how much this is actually going to change the landscape for a lot of other colleges, and I would say it's probably not going to change it. And we are talking about the very top tier schools and what they found and what they're optimizing for, which is probably different from the school that's number 686, not an Ivy League school. So I would just caution people to take in and absorb some of the context and nuance that we provided in this conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Sam Hassell from Westchester Prep. And you can get a free trial of Achievable ACT course by going to achievable.me and be sure to use the code podcast to get 10% off if you like it.